I don't have a lot to go over today, but I do want us to get started on that time period, and we have some poetry to talk about today and also poetry on Thursday. Next week, we start with Othello. The only two things that we're really working on this unit is Renaissance poetry and Shakespearean drama. And then we'll be moving on after that. But if you go to the 16th and 17th centuries, for today, you should have read, where's the calendar? For today, you should have read the Introduction to the 16th Century. I want to talk about that reading because it's a chunky reading. It's not overwhelming, I don't think, for college, but it's pretty chunky. And there are several of them in the units for this term. I think you can skim it. I'm just going to be straight up honest with you. There are not questions about history on the midterm or on the exam or on the discussions. There are questions that ask you to apply history to the literature. So for example, discussion number 3 is about how does the poetry that we've studied demonstrate the qualities of Renaissance poetry? So you need to know the qualities of Renaissance poetry. Discussion number 4 is about humanism, which I'm going to do a little talk on today. It's a movement that we see prominent in the Renaissance. And so it's asking you to apply qualities of Othello to the idea of the time period of humanism. So, I mean, I think you should skim it. I think you should be aware. But if you've taken a European history course, if you've taken world history, I think you're going to basically be fine. They go into a lot of depth in the textbook about the monarchs and the infighting and the wars. And this isn't a history class, it's a literature class. But we have to rely on the history a little bit to understand what's happening at the time period because it influences the literature. So whenever you see, this background stuff, I do want you to look at it, skim through it. If there's something that is more literary based, you should probably jot that down. But I'm just telling you, I've already seen the midterm and the final, and there's not going to be questions that are solely about history or like what year did Queen Elizabeth die or anything like that. So I'm trying to infuse my talks on the literature with the elements of history that you need to know. So if you're here, if you're paying attention, if you're keeping up to date, I think you should be fine. But I did officially put it on here as background info. And then we have 3 poems to look at. So I want to go through a slideshow. If you go to other materials, this is where I put all of the other things that I'll be referencing in class this unit. Right now, I'm going to go through the medieval and Renaissance poetry. So one of the other things that they will ask you about on the midterm and the final is how does literature change from period to period? How does the English language change from period to period? What's the evolution of literature and the language? So periodically, I will do a PowerPoint when we're moving into a new unit, and I'll walk you through the differences of the time period so that you can see what's changing in literature. So on this one, I want to talk about the basic qualities of medieval literature that we've already studied. We already know it from the last unit, but then how do those compare, or how can we compare, contrast that with what's going to be happening in the Renaissance? This PowerPoint is right here under other materials. It's right here. So if you want access to it, you can click there. Where was I here? So first, let me review what we learned about medieval literature. Medieval literature was all about heroic legends and romances like Gawain, the frame tale like Canterbury Tales, and religious allegory like the Pardoner's Tale. The topics in that literature were morality, biblical stories, social status, high and low, like we see in The Wife of Bath, chivalry, like we see in Gawain. The Middle Ages the literature was focused on the power of God. There were a lot of religious texts. Even Canterbury Tales, as varied as it is and as bawdy as it is in places, it still is a religious text. They're all on a trip to a cathedral to pray. So religious texts, the idea that social status is God ordained. If you're a farmer, God meant for your people to be farmers. Your dad and your grandpa and everybody in your family was a farmer on the same plot of land. Your kids are going to be farmers, and that's how God wants it. And the idea that people who are noble or royal were born into those positions. That's something that we see in the Middle Ages, and it's a little depressing because you're sort of born into your lot in life, and that's just what you have to accept. We're going to see a shift on that in the Renaissance. But in the Middle Ages, it's just sort of, the caste system. Bible-centered literature, chivalry as a moral code, and then this cosmic reward and punishment system. So this idea that, life is in the hands of God, and you'll either be praised or punished for adhering to his rules. That's going to shift a little bit in the Renaissance too. So when we get to the Renaissance in England, we have a shift from the power of God to the power of man. And this is where that idea of humanism comes up. You'll be writing about humanism in discussion number 4. So I want to go over it, and you can jot some stuff down, or this slide might help you. So in the Renaissance, it's an enlightened period. It's an enlightened time. The people started to think about having their own power and not just relying on God to control their lives. That's sort of in a way, a victim mentality, or like powerless position. Well, my cart broke and my ox died and my farm's withering up. I guess that's just what God wants. Is the medieval viewpoint. The Renaissance says, you know what, a person has a certain power over their own destiny, certain power over their own future. And there are things that you can do to help yourself and to improve your situation. And that idea that we take for granted, I mean, it's embedded in the American dream, right? If you work hard enough, then you can accomplish anything. That wasn't a thing in the Middle Ages. You're just expected to work hard. And so the Renaissance is the first dawning of this idea that man has the power to control his or her own life. And there's certain steps that you can take, opportunities that you can take to build that life for yourself. And that's a earth-shattering thing when you think about it, going from the Dark Ages to that. So this affected literature in a couple of different ways. Reading changed. So the consumer of literature changed. It was less for learning about religious duties and learning about, the moral code of religion, and more for personal pleasure. People started reading ancient works, the Greeks, and that's called classicism. And they started reading works that were personal. I'm interested in this subject, or if it's about making myself better, maybe I can read this book and it will improve me in some way. Still, there's a lot of illiteracy, but there's this idea that reading can empower you, not just teach you how you're supposed to behave through religious teachings. So there's more variety that we see in the Renaissance. There are lots of types of poetry, various types of plays. There are even essays. We're not going to study any, but the essay comes to power during this time as well. Writing, the way that authors thought about their work, shifted into personal expression. So a lot of writers started, instead of writing about what God thinks we should do, and started writing about their own thoughts and emotions and that sort of thing. The development of complex ideas, the exploration of man's abilities, these are all things that expand literature during this time period. That's what a Renaissance is, right? So there's a complexity that starts happening in the literature that we didn't see in the Middle Ages, and this exploration of man's potential. All of this leads to the idea of, let's pay attention to the pleasures of now. In the Middle Ages, if you're studying religious doctrine, the pleasures all happen in the next life. You work hard at your farm or whatever your job is in this lifetime, and God will reward you if you act in a moral, upstanding way. The rewards are all in the afterlife. In the Renaissance, they start to realize that they have power over having pleasure in this life, right? Life is finite, so let's, YOLO. let's enjoy life while we can. So there's a lot more food, fellowship, theater, love, that kind of thing, and the literature reflects that. But there's also more of a mortality. They're coming out of the bubonic plague, and those lessons were pretty strict lessons to learn. So there's also a fear of death. If you're enjoying the pleasures of now, you don't want death to end it. So in the works that we'll see, you should be looking for that quality, the fear of what is to come. Just a note about the word Renaissance. When we look at the Renaissance, it's important to remember that there are two kind of different Renaissances. When we say the Renaissance, usually what we mean is the Italian Renaissance. We mean the 15th century Renaissance that occurred starting in Florence and throughout Italy, focusing on mainly the visual arts, things like painting, sculpture, architecture, that kind of element. There was an element in poetry. Petrarch was writing his Petrarchan sonnets during that time. But the English Renaissance that we're talking about is a whole 100 years later. They didn't get enlightened the same time as the Italians did. It took time for the ideas of the Italian Renaissance to travel and, make their way to other places in the world, and other people started to think about, these sorts of concepts. So the focus in English Renaissance is more on literature and music, but it has the same basic principles, that rebirth, that idea of we can rethink science, we can rethink the arts. All right, this looks like a lot, but I do think this is the most important slide in the presentation. Discussion number 3 is going to ask you, how do the qualities of English Renaissance poetry show up in the poetry that we read this week? Discussion 3 isn't due until next Friday, not this Friday, there's no discussion this week, but this information right here is what I would use to answer that question. So let me go through it. The medieval English poetry, we know that it had these qualities, this rhyming couplets and no standard spelling. We know what that looked like because we looked at the Canterbury Tales and so on. In English Renaissance poetry, we see more complex structures, rhyme, meter. Remember when we did sonnets first semester and we said, oh, they have to have 14 lines and 10 syllables per line, and it rhymes in a certain way, and it's broken up into these quatrains and couplets. So there's more complexity to the structures of poetry in the English Renaissance. There's also the elevation of language. Chaucer tried to make English a legitimate language. People kind of accepted that, but it for sure gets more legit in the Renaissance because they start using some of the same qualities that we see in Italian and Latin and French to make the work more complex and elevate the language with vocabulary. There's more standardized spelling. It's not 100% standardized because there's no dictionary, but until the 1700s, but there's more standardized spelling, so it's a little bit easier to read. Complex comparisons. You'll see really complex metaphors in the poetry of the Renaissance that we just didn't see in medieval poetry. There's a term called conceit. A conceit, it's spelled the same way as conceited. A conceit is an extended metaphor that the poet continues throughout, and it's usually something really involved. And we'll see it in the first poem that you looked at for today, the one about I wrote her name upon the strand. So I'll talk about conceits when we get to that, but that's more complex comparison. The focus on personal emotions and private circumstances, the internal life, more than the spiritual life with God. Pastoral or nature topics. The word pastoral, you're going to hear me reference that fairly frequently. Pastoral just means like country life. And it means, the simplified life of living out in the country. And one of our poems deals with that too, the passionate shepherd to his love. Because people started thinking, well, that's a easier life to live out there just herding sheep. And it seems simple. Do you ever think back to what it was like when you were younger and think, oh, I had it made and I didn't even know it when I was in kindergarten? Nap time and juice boxes, and my homework was 5 addition problems, and you look back and you go, oh, that was so simple and nice compared to now. And it's the same thing with the pastoral imagery, right? In a lot of Renaissance literature, that people are hearkening back to a simpler time when things were less complex, because with the Renaissance and the rebirth of all these ideas comes more complexity to life. So you'll see a lot of nature topics and pastorals. The mortality versus immortality is key to Renaissance poetry at this time. What can remain if we die? How can we leave things behind? Beowulf had his legend. What do the Renaissance people have? And the writers, the poets, actually come up with the idea, and we see it in the Strand poem also, because it's about leaving a legacy of literature and humanism, which I've already talked about. So the reason I think these things are super important, take a screenshot or jot them down or whatever, because on discussion 3, the question is, how do these elements show up in the Renaissance poetry that we're reading this week? Yeah, so I'm just giving you a heads up on that one. All right, let's look at the pieces that you read for today. Should have read 3 poems. And if you have questions, I'm just going to go through them generally. And I might make a couple of comments that would help you with discussion 3. I don't know. I've been known to. And this is sonnet 75. And the way it is in your textbook is you can see that the spelling is not standardized. Maybe you looked up a new version of it so that you could understand it, but I'll talk about it basically. This poem is a Spenserian sonnet. A Spenserian sonnet is a lot like a Shakespearean sonnet, but what Spenser did in his, to make him different, every poet has to do something a different way, is he changed the rhyme scheme. So it's essentially a Shakespearean sonnet with the rhyme scheme adjusted. Instead of A, B, C, D, C, D, like we see in a Shakespearean sonnet, this one has interlocking rhyme or interwoven rhyme. I'll show it to you. It says, one day I wrote her name upon the strand. That rhymes with hand. So we have A, B, A. Strand, away, hand. And then pray rhymes with away. So at the beginning, the first quatrain is just like a Shakespearean sonnet. A, B, A, B. But then you can see line 5 rhymes with lines 4 and 2. So this is B, not C. Away, pray, essay, decay. So the same rhyme that was B here continues into the second quatrain as the first rhyme. So it goes A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, E, E. Did I do that right? I think I did that right. Yeah, so there's still a couplet here, but he's sort of continuing that rhyme from the previous quatrain. And that's what's different about a Spenserian sonnet. But it's the same thing with the quatrains broken up and so on. So this poem is about, just let me summarize it. It's hard for me to read it because of the way that it's written here. But it's about this guy who wrote his love's name in the sand. They give you a note. Always read your footnotes. Otherwise, you're not going to know that strand is really like the sand on the beach. Because they have the note over here on the side. So if it's a 0, then the word's over here. If it's a number, then it's down here. So the speaker says, I wrote her name upon the strand, but the waves came up, because we've all been to the beach and we know what happens when you do something in the sand. The water eventually comes up and ruins it. Sandcastles, all that sort of thing. So I wrote it again, he says, because I wanted my love for her to be permanent. So here's a tip, don't write it in the sand. But yeah, so it's a metaphor for the permanence of their relationship. They can't have a permanent relationship because one day they will both die, and their relationship will die when that happens. So as we know it on Earth. So he says, I kept trying to write her name in the sand, and the waves kept coming to wash. So the waves become a metaphor for time, and the writing of the name becomes the human quality of wanting to be permanent in this world. You know, we don't want to die. We want to be permanent. It's not possible. And time will eventually erase all of us. The woman that he's writing her name says, vain man, she says, what do you, that's dumb to try to do that. She said it's pointless. You shouldn't try to do that because, you know, number one, how important are you? And number two, time will win. We're just human beings. We're just specks on this earth, and there's nothing that you can do to immortalize something that is mortal. And our love is not going to last forever. And so he says, not so, right here. So, and you can see the second quatrain is her response, and then the third quatrain is him responding back to her. So there's still that quatrain structure. And he says, no, I think I can find a way to make it last forever. Even though we will end up dying, you shall live by fame. My verse will eternalize us. So he says, my poetry will suffice to keep us immortal. And when death happens, our love shall live because I wrote about it in our poetry. And he wasn't wrong, because here we are still reading it. In some way, it still lingers and it still exists, and his promise to her that their love will be immortal is still existent. That's another quality. I didn't put it on the list, but it's another quality of Renaissance poetry, that the end kind of has a positive spin to it. There's an uplifting element, whereas the Renaissance, I mean, the medieval poetry, it tends to be a little more somber. So in this poem, you can see they talk a lot about death, and they talk about their love being only temporary, but he says, I'll find a way to make it last forever. And he does in this sonnet. So if you have questions about the pieces when you were reading them, you can put them in the chat and I'll address them before I move on to the next one. Or I can come back to them. Okay, the next two poems that you had for today are kind of fun because the third one is a response to the second one. I hope you picked up on that. Christopher Marlowe wrote this poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. It's super famous. This is an example of a pastoral. This is an example of let's go live the easy life as shepherds in the field out in the, you know, boonies. Let me read it to you, because the way that it sounds is echoed in the next poem as well. So this one goes, the passionate shepherd to his love. So that tells us who's speaking. Passionate shepherd is the speaker, and he's speaking to the woman that he desires. He says, come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove, that valleys, groves, hills, and fields, woods or steepy mountain yields. And we will sit upon the rocks, seeing their shepherds feed their flocks by shallow rivers, to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. And I will make thee beds of roses and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cap of flowers and a kirtle embroidered all with leaves of myrtle, a gown made of the finest wool, which from our pretty lambs we pull, fair lined slippers for the cold with buckles of the purest gold, a belt of straw and ivy buds with coral clasps and amber studs. And if these pleasures may thee move, come live with me and be my love. The shepherd swains shall dance and sing for thy delight each May morning. If these delights thy mind may move, then live with me and be my love. Oh, if it could only be so perfect, right? That's like the ideal love poem. That's the thing of pastoral. It's like, this would be the ideal life. We'll sort of like have this calm existence where we make all of our clothes and things from the wool of our sheep, and it will be beautiful and, you know, calm. He doesn't talk about how you're gonna have to get up at the crack of dawn to go and feed those sheep. You know, he doesn't talk about what it's gonna take to get the wool from the sheep. Like, none of the negative stuff is there. What about the winters? You know, none of that stuff. It's all about come live with me and be my love as a shepherd. And it's that simple life that he's appealing to. I don't see any questions in the comments. So Sir Walter Raleigh, so the story goes that Marlowe in Passionate Shepherd, that the poem circulated a while. It wasn't published really until Marlowe was dead. He died young in a bar fight. But anyway, the poem had been passed around, and some people were praising it, some people were making fun of it, and so Sir Walter Raleigh wrote a response, and this is that one. So this is like an anti-pastoral. It's almost a satire, because he writes it in the same structure with the same rhyme scheme and metrical pattern so that it sounds the same. But what he does is he envisions the woman's response, like what the woman's going to say to him. He says nymph here. Nymph is a fairy, because he says, just by naming her a nymph, he's suggesting that the girl that Marlowe was writing to was imaginary. No woman is going to go do that. And so the nymph is replying to the shepherd. So the voice here is the woman that he was talking to in Marlowe's poem. And you already know that she shoots him down pretty sharply. So the nymph's reply to the shepherd: "If all the world and love were young, and truth in every shepherd's tongue, these pretty pleasures might me move to live with thee and be thy love. Time drives the flocks from field to fold, when rivers rage and rocks grow cold, and Philomel becometh dumb." That's a bird. "The rest complains of cares to come. The flowers do fade, and wanton fields to wayward winter reckoning yields. A honey tongue, a heart of gall, is fancy's spring, but sorrow's fall. Thy gowns, thy shoes, thy beds of roses, thy cap, thy kirtle, and thy posies soon break, soon wither, soon forgotten, in folly ripe, in reason rotten. Thy belt of straw and ivy buds, thy coral clasps and amber studs, all these in me no means can move to come to thee and be thy love. But could youth last and love still breed, had joys no date nor age no need, then these delights my mind might move to live with thee and be thy love." So it ends, at least, she completely shoots him down through the whole poem, saying, "That's a nice picture that you paint, but that's not reality. And that's not how it would be. And even if it was like that, it'd only be for a short period of time before all those things would fade. So, you're promising me something that isn't even real." But at the end, you've got this shift, right? You've got a shift right here with the word "but." However, if your little fantasy was real, then yes, I would come with you and be your love. So there's that little positive element on the end. So in this, we can see that quality of mortality, right? The idea that, even if you could live this way for, a year, 5 years, however long, we would get old. The whole situation would get old. The rocks would get cold. Like all the stuff that he's using in Marlowe's poem to lure her, she sort of breaks all of them down and says they're all going to fade. But it's nice to think it. And so that's the ending part right there. Questions on this one? I'm hoping that you can see some of the elements of that slide in these poems. This one here. I'm touching on some of them. You'll have to draw them out in your discussion next week, but I'm giving you a little heads up on that to help you. Okay, if there aren't any questions on that, then let me go to the calendar. There is a study guide for Renaissance poetry. I put it's the same one here and here. So on Thursday, I will go over this and ask you if there's any questions once we finish the other poems. The other poems for Thursday are 5 Shakespearean sonnets. The page numbers are on the Blackboard. Right here, these are the pages where you'll find them in the PDF. So read a little bit of background on Shakespeare. That's just a couple of pages. That's not a big deal. And then read the introduction to the sonnets. And then each one of these 5 sonnets here. Now, we will talk about them in class on Thursday, but if you need a refresher, about Shakespearean sonnets. I did put together a little, what I'm calling an anatomy of a sonnet, and it's here under course materials to help you if you need help with that. You can click here, or if you just want to refresh your memory on Shakespearean sonnets, because there's 5, you need to do, you know, like a analysis of them so that when you come to class, you've got background on them. Anatomy of a Shakespeare sonnet. So this one is a little PowerPoint that I put together. I'll come back to that slide. Just as a reminder, with one of the sonnets we're not reading for Thursday, just a reminder of the structure and how you can use the structure to help you figure out the meaning and the rhyme and the meter. So all that is laid out for you in that. And on the second slide, I do have a video. I made it sometime back for another class. So at the beginning, I think I say something about a quiz, but that same poem that is in this slideshow, you can watch me go through it and explain, you know, go through the analysis of it from beginning to end, if that will help you. There's a video there. So there's some help there for you in case you are a little rusty on your Shakespearean sonnets for Thursday. We do not have class on Friday. There is not a discussion this week. I kind of wanted to leave this week open because I thought, well, there's a 3-day weekend, and if you just cram it with work, it's not really a bonus. I do think it might be good for you to start looking at Act 1 of Othello. We're going to go through Othello in 2 weeks, which is quite quick. Act 1 is Tuesday next week. Act 2 is Thursday. The acts aren't terribly long. I'm flipping a lot through here. The page numbers in the PDF are here on Blackboard. So, you know, it's Shakespearean, so it takes you a little bit longer to read it, maybe look up some words, look at footnotes and so on. But I'm just thinking you might want to, if you're finished and ahead, you might want to start looking at that so that you don't get too jammed up with Othello. Like if you've already read Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2, you know, somewhere in here, then you're kind of, you don't have that much to do on Wednesday, you know, that kind of thing, get a head start. So any questions about what we're doing on Thursday or next week? I'm looking in the chat. Lots of questions about scholarships and stuff. So I see that there's a need there. I will post the scholarship stuff that I was telling you about later today, and I'll work on a little like video series that will give you ideas on how you can be the most efficient with that. Okay. All right, I'm gonna go then. I'm just about at an hour, so I will see you again on Thursday. Hope you all have a good day. Enjoy the sunshine out there. Bye.